Hello, hello, and welcome. Welcome to this very special edition of Atlas Information Live. Happy Easter to you, your family, and to your loved ones, and all you hold dear. This is being Easter Sunday. It is, at least in Christendom, the most sacred day of the year, the celebration of Jesus's resurrection from the dead. And it means, well, there is actually so much that's included or that this particular event represents. And the secrets, the esoteric secrets around Easter are much discussed online and in different forums, and you'll get all sorts of information about how this is actually a pagan feast day going back to Ishtar or Oyster, depending on how you pronounce that particular fertility goddess's name. And much about the superficial trappings of Easter and what has since been commercialized. The painting of eggs and chocolate rabbits and all the rest of it. The Spring Fertility Festival has always been a feature of just about every culture, high civilization, certainly civilizations that had a prominent agrarian or agricultural element to them. But the connection between this time of year and the notion of rebirth is inseparable. And it goes back beyond this humanity. It was celebrated in Atlantis, it was celebrated in Lemuria. And in fact, it was commonplace for couples to be married, to travel great distances, to go to study in the temples, study the practice of white tantra, sexual alchemy, during the time of the spring seasons of fertility. And in fact, during that time, before the fall of humanity, couples traveled distances to attend retreats, sacred retreats held by the temples devoted to the divine feminine. And there they would practice white tantra and learn its secrets for the purpose of achieving immaculate conception. This is the origin of what eventually became known as the honeymoon. This notion that couples, once they are married, they go on a trip, they go on a a holiday to consummate the marriage. But that's a very superficial, shadowy reflection of the origin of these traditions as they relate to death and rebirth as the natural cycle of nature. This is inherent to life. Death and rebirth is as inherent and natural to existence as humidity is to water. And it is in that spirit that we must observe anything related to the Christ with the same reverence and comprehensiveness that the Christ is in everything. Nothing exists without the Christ. And that inherent fundamental nature of nature, that all things die and are renewed in some way, right? It's called the law of conservation of energy. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but it's transformed from one form to another, to another, to another. What makes that possible is the fire of fires and the light of lights. It is that foundational force in the universe that is the fire and light of Christ. Nature would not have that characteristic quality to it of death and rebirth, of season after season after season. And no pagan religion throughout history anywhere in the world would intuit to make a sacred feast day during springtime, during the vernal equinox. Unless they felt deep down the being impulse to recognize and to see reflected in everything around them that essence, that spark, that seed within them, whose nature is birth, death, and sacrifice. Death and rebirth. Because all of nature around us that gives us life, including the water we drink, the air we breathe, the plants and animals, and everything that we need to survive. All of that is in a process of sacrificing and dying for our sake and being reborn as us. The death and resurrection of Jesus, the man that we celebrate, was not arbitrarily grafted on to these so-called pagan festivals. The life and crucifixion, death and rebirth, in other words, the life, the sacrifice, death and rebirth of the embodied Christ, Jesus the man, Jesus of Nazareth, is in many ways the ultimate expression of that cosmic Christos force, which is at the very foundation of all reality, of all existence, but that seeks to express and know itself and test the limits of its capacity to embody selflessness in a universe of mechanical, selfish materialism. Because it's undeniable that on the material plane of existence, the mechanical algorithms of nature function as self-serving programs. Consider the survival instinct. Consider the drive to procreate. In other words, to assure survival of the species. And as individuals in nature, individuals are often in a state of competition with the other organisms around them, be they different organisms or members of the same family of organisms, members of the same troop, of the same pack, of the same pride, of the same herd. We see males, for instance, competing for mates, for mating rights. And there's this element of self-interest that's expressed mechanically on that level. And we all know what that is. Because that animal nature, that selfish, self-serving, egotistical, fearful, lustful, prideful, greedy, all those algorithms that whisper to us in our mind, in the voices in our head saying, oh, do this, do that. And they drive us with desires of all kinds and cravings and aversions. And they convince us that they are us because each and every one of them presents as an I. I want this, I don't want that. And it creates that never-ending stream of consciousness in the busy mind. And each one of those algorithms presents itself as an I. And that's what creates the illusion of this separated self, this false self that we identify with as I, and all the things that we like and all the things that we don't like. So this is not a mystery to us. This is not a secret. If we observe ourselves, if we know ourselves, we know this to be true. We know that we exist in this animal form, and absolutely in secular science and psychology, they are absolutely convinced since Freud and since Darwin that we are just animals, that we are just another beast, just like any other, just a little bit more evolved. We had a better luck of the draw, and that we evolved further than any other beast on this planet, but that we are nothing more. And the atheists stand by that. And all that represents an aspect or a level of being which expresses the foundational nature of the fire of birth, death, and sacrifice, expressing through that mechanicity in that mechanical way. Still, nature constantly is being renewed. And still, nature has this inherent, built-in nature of sacrifice, despite the fact that individuals are looking out for themselves all the time. They don't want to die out of fear, the instinct to survive. And yet, we see in the broader picture of nature and of ecosystems and so on, we see that animals are constantly being sacrificed for the sake of other animals, for the sake of plants, and so on and so forth. Beings for the sake of other beings. But on that level of mechanicity, all of that is happening automatically, mechanically, like clockwork. But still we can see that essence. But it's one thing, and that, by the way, is one of the reasons why it is possible for human beings to become hypnotized by mechanical nature and worship it, like we have around the world so many different religions and spiritual traditions which worship mechanical nature, because at its heart it is still the Christ. Because every being is a monad. Every being has, at the very center of its being, that spark, that seed, that connection to the great source of everything. And the Christ represents that force which emanates from that source and puts into activity that selfless nature. And when we contemplate or meditate on the nature of selflessness, and we comprehend that we've given that selflessness a name and we call it love. And then when we contemplate and meditate on what are the highest expressions of love, invariably, whether one is a Christian or not, whether one is religious or not, invariably, the pinnacle of selflessness, the highest expression of love, is to sacrifice oneself for the sake of others, to the point of, up to and including, sacrificing one's own life, giving one's life for the sake of others. And so, whether you are celebrating nature and the abundance of nature and the renewal at springtime, and the fact that that abundance in nature the abundant crops and the bounty of fruit and everything that springs forth and renews itself in the springtime. It is that sacrifice that you are recognizing and celebrating, that following the harvest in the fall and the entrance into winter, all of nature seems to go dormant. It seems to die in a very real way when the leaves fall from the trees and so on and so forth, and the crops get plowed into the dirt. I mean, those plants have died. The annuals. So the springtime renewal really is a rebirth. It's a rebirth on so many different levels. And to honor and revere and worship that renewal, that despite having sacrificed, given of itself so that we may live, and given up its bounty so that we could take that bounty and store it away and can it in jars and in freezers and so on for the winter. It has now returned from the dead. And it is now ready to do what? To renew itself, to be reborn, and to grow and to flourish and to develop and cultivate a whole new bounty to give to us. These three elements of sacrifice, death, and rebirth, these are the absolute fundamental nature of Christ, the underlying force in the universe. So naturally, as a matter of course, were the Christ to become man, to incarnate into a vehicle of flesh and blood, it would have to, by virtue of its own nature, it would have to undergo a story and play out a drama in the mechanics of this level of reality, of mechanical nature. It would have to play out the divine drama of sacrifice, death, and rebirth in order to become a living embodiment of that nature, of the Christic nature, of the Christic force. And that is what we see playing out during Holy Week in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We see a man undergoing and playing out this cosmic drama whereby he becomes the living embodiment of the Christos force by virtue of aligning his mortal, physical, mechanical self with the qualities of absolute selflessness. And in that alignment, the Christ is able to enter and to fully occupy and take root and now be present here within that otherwise mortal vessel, but the mortal vessel is made immortal. By virtue of the level that it attained. As we looked at last week, Holy Week begins with Palm Sunday. And in that part of the story, Jesus enters into Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven, riding on the back of a donkey. And we spent all last week going over the significance of that symbol, that he was in command and control of his animal self, of his animal mind. That stubborn beast, he had subdued it, he had tamed it, so much so that he could ride triumphantly in upon it. The events of Holy Week follow, whereby the next day, Monday, Jesus was ejecting the moneylenders and the livestock traders from the temple. This, for the sake of the drama, is what precipitated Jesus's arrest by the authorities, by the Pharisees, who then take him and present him to Pilate, demanding that he be crucified. But that act of overturning the tables and throwing out the moneylenders and the livestock traders, which was the tradition at the time, because they were exchanging funds, and they were lending funds so that people could buy animals to sacrifice to Yahweh in the temple. That was part of the Passover tradition. And the great mystery that Jesus played out as part of the drama was to shine a light on the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and those moneylenders and the livestock traders and the whole Jewish tradition of sacrificing others to God. And by overturning the tables and chasing out the moneylenders, Jesus was saying, this is a travesty. This is not what the Christ would do. You know, the Christians have that, what would Jesus do? It's hypocrisy to believe that you are going to get into God's good graces by going to the temple and sacrificing another creature, another being. The very notion that anyone would consider this a spiritual or noble or religious act is beyond comprehension. And yet, we see time and time again that that is precisely what religion degenerates into. And very often, we see that it is precisely the most helpless and innocent of creatures who end up on the sacrificial altar. Going right back to Babylon, where there was child sacrifice. And you can go to the Aztecs and everywhere around the world. There are animals that are being sacrificed and child sacrifice. And by the way, it's not by accident that there's an abortion clinic on every street corner in the United States. These are very much the Black Lodge's modus operandi. Because remember, mechanical nature is about self-preservation. And that in their view, from their perspective, from their point of view, they gain strength by sacrificing others. And so, because their job is to twist, tempt, and corrupt all that is good and pure and of the light, and ensnare it and enslave it in mechanicity, which is another word for that is selfishness, right? The antithesis of selflessness. If love and God and the Christ are the absolute spirit of selflessness, then clearly mechanicity is the absolute expression of selfishness. That's that I, that's that ego, that's where that comes from. Look out for number one. So anytime you see anybody or any tradition sacrificing someone else or something else to the gods in order to win their favor, you know that that spiritual tradition has been degenerated. And Holy Week and the cosmic drama that Jesus plays out is there to reveal to us, to show us beyond all reasonable doubt that this is the nature of God. This is love. And this is how God himself chooses to be in the world. Selfless. And so naturally, he would abhor that his temple, built in his name, supposedly there to worship him and to show respect and reverence for him, his worldly representative, would not abide the hypocrisy of sacrificing others and sacrificing the innocent. This is abhorrent. And it's not that Jesus was angry, but the severity of tough love showed itself that day, and the ferocity of the light, the ferocity of the fire. I don't know if you've ever witnessed firsthand what a forest fire is like, but if you have, then you know the ferocity that just regular old fire can take in terms of renewing the landscape. Because forest fires, it turns out, are essential to renewal. It's an essential aspect of renewal of nature. These occasional forest fires. Now, they get a little bit out of control these days because of the lack of proper maintenance, and there's a whole bunch of different issues. I don't want to get sidetracked on that right now. But the point is that the fire that renews can be very severe and very ferocious in renewal and in doing what must be done. And that day when Jesus ejected the moneylenders and the livestock traders, he did it with that ferocity that later Christians called righteous anger, because they loved, for whatever reason, they couldn't let go of the angry, vengeful God of the Old Testament, I suppose. But that was what followed the Palm Sunday was that episode. We're going to skip over right to Thursday, and we're going to go straight to the Passover meal, where Jesus taught his disciples the holy unction, the Eucharist, in other words. This is my body, which will be given up for you, and this is my blood. It will be spilled, it will be shed for you and for all, so that sins may be forgiven, etc., etc. Do this in memory of me. He also, at the Last Supper, when he announced and he ritualized the sacrifice of the body and blood of Christ, and that he demonstrated that we can, as Gnostics, perform that unction even if we don't go to church. We can pray and meditate and bless bread, unleavened bread, and drink grape juice, and bless and meditate over unleavened bread and grape juice. And we can perform the holy unction. We focus and we concentrate until that bread and that wine, that grape juice, are transformed, transmuted into the body and blood of Christ. And there are articles on glorian.com on how to do this. I think they have a video as well on YouTube that describes this in greater detail. And I'm sure Master Samael wrote in one or more books on how to do it. But the idea there is that you are what you eat. And if you consciously apply yourself to knowingly recognize and be cognizant that the foundation of that bread and the foundation of that wine, what gives it its life-giving properties, its power to feed your body, its power to transmute from what it is through death and rebirth, it can become a part of you. If you consciously comprehend that what gives food its power to sacrifice for your sake, that power is the Christ and is the nature of Christ, as I described at the beginning. Sacrifice, death, and rebirth. That's the nature of Christ. So if you can consciously comprehend that and consciously consume the bread of life, the body of Christ, and that when you drink that wine, you are drinking the blood of Christ. You are drinking the essential nature of the Christ itself, the capacity for death, sacrifice, and rebirth. Then you will incorporate and impart unto yourself. You will benefit from the Christic atoms, the atomic forces of sacrifice, death, and rebirth will become a part of who you are. And that's why that rite, that ritual, is so prevalent in Christianity, and it's prevalent in Christian Gnosticism. And Master Samael taught it, Master Samael performed it, and if you go to a Gnostic center, once you are past a certain point and you are initiated into what's known as second chamber, if you attend a Gnostic Mass, you will discover that the Holy Eucharist, or the Gnostic unction, you can give it different names, is an essential component of the Gnostic Mass, just as it is the Catholic Mass and so many other masses of the Christian denominations, and the Greek Orthodox Mass as well, if I'm not mistaken. And in fact, in many churches, they still give the chalice as well, and they still serve wine, and not just the bread, but wine during Mass. Not, I believe the Orthodox churches do that. And there are other Christian denominations that do it. The Catholic Church stopped doing it for, no doubt, financial reasons, and what they said were probably health concerns. But in any case, but another event took place following the Last Supper on Thursday, and that is Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. We can, from our limited point of view, kind of see the significance of that. But I'm not sure if we truly can embody and appreciate just how humiliating that act would have been. How awkward and strange for the disciples that their master was getting down on his knees to wash their feet. This was an act that, at best, was performed by servants or women, which, of course, we're talking 2,000 years ago, so and beyond, right? So was a different times, a different place, and women's role was to serve. And so a lot of these domestic type activities, and these lowly, lower form activities were left to servants and to women. Um, and so the fact that you had Jesus, the teacher, the rabbi, getting down on his knees and washing the feet of his students, of his followers, the significance of that is one which I have tried in many cases and in many different ways to impress upon you the importance of radical humility. Radical humility. Not just a little bit of humility. Not it's hard to be humble when you're as great as I am. No, no, no. Radical humility. And that's what Jesus's washing of his disciples' feet. How low are you willing to go? How low are you willing to place yourself? Position yourself for the sake of others. It's a different kind of sacrifice. But it is the sacrifice that constitutes the demonstration of your readiness to let go of the I of pride, the identification and attachment to self-importance, to self-righteousness, to self-aggrandizement, to self-worship, to self-love. Self-love not in the positive sense, but in the sense of narcissism, in the negative sense, in the sense of too much self-love and too much self-respect. You see, Jesus lived at a time when, had he performed that act of getting down on his knees and washing his disciples' feet, if he would have done that in public, or if he would have done that in view of the Pharisees, they would have berated him and ridiculed him, and they would have lashed out, and they would have essentially called him a heretic, because a rabbi doesn't do that. That he would be blamed for and berated and ridiculed and scolded and punished for belittling the position of teacher, of rabbi. Now, there are stories in the Bible where Jesus did perform acts of humility, and within the sight of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees predictably reacted negatively to it. And they had all sorts of excuses and all sorts of ways, like all passive aggressive types do, of poo-pooing the act. And one of the things they love to say is, "Oh, you think you're holier than we are," or something, or "You think you're better than God, or better than Elijah," or they come up with all of these rationalizations to belittle and to just dispudiate Jesus, and to basically spit on him and take him down a notch. But when Jesus himself takes himself down a notch, this is the greatest of threats to those in power and authority. Because when you humble yourself, what can they do to you? How can they ridicule you? How can they try to take you down a notch when you yourself have put yourself to the bottom rung? Right? How can they knock you off the ladder? How can they take you down a peg? You yourself have put yourself down a peg, down to the bottom rung. You've made of yourself the lowest of the low. But why have you done that? There's a story that Master Samael recounts in one of his books, where the philosophers, was it Socrates or Aristotle? Aristotle was going with his friends through the public square, and there was coming Sisyphus, another philosopher, and he was an ascetic, and he liked to make a show of the fact that he only had one robe, one toga, and that it was so old and tattered, it was filled with holes. And Aristotle calls out to him from across the square and says, Sisyphus, be careful, we can see your pride through the holes in your toga. And by telling the story, Master Samael was attempting to demonstrate that false modesty is one of the very real dangers that can affect us, and that it helps prop up mystic pride. That there are individuals who yes, they seemingly appear to be humiliating themselves, or taking themselves, self-deprecating themselves, or lowering themselves down, but they're doing so to make a show of it, and to demonstrate. In other words, the modern words for what I'm trying to communicate are best found in this sphere of so-called woke culture. We have this expression called virtue signaling. Now, what is virtue signaling? It is precisely that someone identifies as being a social justice warrior, or more empathetic towards others, or so on. So they will deliberately play the victim, and they will lower themselves, and they will deliberately position themselves in an inferior position, a position not of authority, but of a disadvantaged position, a position of less power and less influence. And in that, from that inferior position, they're virtue signaling, that they say, see, look how good I am, look how holy I am, because I'm down here with the common people, with the little people. Politicians do this, and all manner of whether it's advertising, or you can see famous people of all kinds, movie stars, and politicians, advertisers, companies, brands will do this. And it's just it's false modesty, but in modern vernacular, it's virtue signaling. It's exactly what Aristotle calls Sisyphus out on. It's like, yeah, we know you like to pretend that you're so spiritual because you've given up all your worldly possessions or whatever, and you live with one toga. But clearly you're doing this to signal how humble you are and how spiritual you are, which is mystic pride. This is a very real danger, and you see this. It's not a theoretical danger. You can see it all around you. You can see it in these virtue signaling millionaires, these so-called activists, these millionaire activists, like these Hollywood actors and so on, these celebrities who live in multi-million dollar 20,000, 30,000 square foot mansions, but they're going to wag their finger at you and lecture you because you ate a hamburger. Meanwhile, they're flying on private jets to go visit their friends or whatever. But they're going to wag their finger at you and lecture you about how you're not doing your part. You're not sacrificing enough. Why are you driving instead of taking public transit? And they'll sit there, wag their finger at you, and then they'll climb into their stretch limousine and go to the airport and get into a private jet and fly down to the Caribbean for the weekend. Yeah, but they're wagging their finger at you because you aren't taking public transit. Benjamin says, even some religious leaders can fall into virtue signaling, echoing the kind of outward moral posturing often criticized in historical religious figures, our modern day scribes and Pharisees. And he continues here, he says, especially those that own megachurches. Yeah, well, obviously that's another very good example. Like that's another very clear example. When you have Joel Osteen in his megachurch of 80,000 people, and he's sitting there wagging his finger at them about how they don't give enough to the poor, or they're too materialistic, or they're too concerned with material things. Meanwhile, he lives in a $50 million mansion. It's like 20 is what, how is it, 30,000, 40,000 square feet. It has a helicopter landing pad on the roof, and it's one of the largest houses in that part of the United States. I don't know if it's Texas or Arkansas or wherever he lives, but it's enormous. It's a gigantic compound. But when you listen to him preach, oh yes, he'll preach modesty, and he'll preach simplicity, and he'll preach, all the, but then you'll also get the reverse where I don't want to name any names necessarily, but there are personalities that I'm sure you're familiar with that they're only ever photographed wearing a certain type of garb and looking a certain way because it's part of the role, it's part of the character, it's part of the persona. But then you hear about what goes on behind closed doors, or when the cameras turn off, and you realize, well, that is just an act, it's just a persona. The humble, pious guru who talks a certain way and who looks a certain way and who, so on and so forth. But then he goes and he spends time with world leaders at the World Economic Forum without naming any names. So Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. This is like the ejection of the moneylenders and the livestock traders, like gaining command and control and being lord over his animal self, his animal mind. Ejecting the moneylenders and the livestock traders is also a symbol of eliminating all of the mechanical elements and hypocritical mechanical elements, the selfish elements from the temple, from what is supposed to be pure, in order to welcome God into this temple. So we must be in command of our mind. We must be free and pure. We must be free of the impurities of selfishness and the hypocrisy of sacrificing others, where the nature of who and what we truly are is selflessness. And we must be humble, truly humble. We must overcome the ego of pride. And we must be willing to reduce ourselves and take ourselves down to the bottom rung in the act of serving others, in the act of cleansing others. All these three events of Holy Week are all there to show us how a man must be, how a human being must be. These are three prerequisites before one can become Christified, before one can receive the Christ and become a living embodiment of the Christ. Later, of course, we see Jesus in the garden at Gethsemane. I always get that wrong. I always pronounce that wrong. Gethsemane. I can't even pronounce it. Gethsemane. That's it. Gethsemane. And he prays, of course, and he faces his mortality. He faces the reality of the situation and the he has to face his fear of death. And we cannot embody the Christ without undergoing psychological death. We must accept that the nature of Christ is sacrifice, death, and rebirth. That we cannot embody the Christ unless we embrace sacrifice, death, and rebirth. And what that means is we have to face the sacrifice of ourself and our own death. And that's exactly what Jesus does in the garden. This is where he essentially is given one last chance to back out. And he says those famous words, Lord, if it be possible, let this cup pass before me, but not my will, but thine be done. So it's almost like saying, look, if it's possible, I'd really rather not have to be crucified tomorrow. But my will and what I want and what I'd really rather not go through is not what matters here, is not important. What matters is your will. Your will is what matters. Let your will be done. And in that sense, Jesus in the garden showed us how to pray. And Jesus in the garden showed us what it means to walk the path, certainly the path of the Bodhisattva, the path of Christifixion. Is that certainly it goes without saying that people prefer comfort and security over suffering and sacrifice. But if what you long for is meaning and purpose and lasting peace, joy, and happiness, lasting, enduring, then only by following the will of your Father in heaven, your innermost being, only by doing his will you achieve that. And that may mean, that will mean having to sacrifice, having to go through unpleasant circumstances. Nothing of value comes for free in this universe. That's not how the universe works. It's not to say that the universe is transactional in the way that the economy is, that in the way capitalism is, but we live in a universe of cause and effect. And we live in a universe of balance. And that one cannot embody selflessness by being selfish or by being neutral. Right? You cannot embody selflessness just by receiving and hoarding. Right? This is what the Buddha learned when he went off. He left the palace as a young man, and he abandoned his title, his family, his position, his class, his rank, and all of his wealth and all of his privilege and everything. And he went off into the wilderness, and he went and he joined a group of ascetics, yogis. And for months and months and months, he sat around with them, and he fasted, and he starved himself nearly to the point of death. And these yogis were convinced that by denying themselves and by retreating from the world, they could achieve purity, they could achieve nirvana. And it was then that the Buddha recognized that these yogis had no compassion. And it's not that he could blame them, because they had nothing to give. They had nothing to give. And they had no interest in giving. They only wanted to be left alone. They only wanted to isolate themselves in peace in order to they only wanted to receive. But Buddha knew that the essence of what they sought was compassion, and that compassion is not about receiving. And he knew that there was a disconnect. And so any type of spiritual teaching, any type of metaphysical instruction that focuses on what you receive and what you can get, that teaching will never bring you to Christ. That teaching will never bring you to oneness with God. Because if you focus on what you receive, if that's what you're focused on, this is why all those teachings about manifesting your desires and manifesting what you want and praying to God and getting what you want from God, all of that is taking you further and further and further away from God, because God is selflessness. It's just, you cannot put yourself on a train of selfishness and expect to end up in the station of selflessness, because the two are diametrically opposed. They're antithetical to one another. So if all you're concerned about is me, and what I get, that's taking you further. You cannot become one with the spirit of selflessness that way. And Jesus in the garden, as he prays, that's if you make a prayer that doesn't end with "but not my will but thine be done," or "let all this be done in accordance with the law," it's a recognition and a comprehension and an acknowledgement that, yes, I'm in need right now. I could use this, or I could use that, or please help this person, or please help that person. But let my petition be heard in the greater context of the will of my Father and the overarching balance of the law. That I'm just, I have petitions, I have wants or needs or things that I believe that I need, or I'm suffering and it's a little bit too much and I can't take it anymore. But I recognize that if this is my Father's will, then let his will be done. And if I am paying for past transgressions and that my suffering is in accordance with the law, then so be it. That is what Jesus in the garden is showing us. Again, it is practical teaching on how a mortal must be in relationship with God, in a relationship with selflessness. Because all of Holy Week is leading up to that magical moment on Easter Sunday. When what used to be a man walks out of that cave, a living God, a Christified master. But he started out as a man. Well, but one doesn't go from being a man to a Christified master overnight and willy-nilly and just because. There are key steps that need to be taken, and there are key attributes. There are ways of being that we must embody. And Jesus is showing us these, and in some ways, literally and figuratively, symbolically. At the same time, there are multiple levels. Of course, in the garden, he's approached by some Roman soldiers, and Judas goes up and kisses him on the cheek, and that's the sign to the Romans that this was the man that they're looking for, that they're called to bring in. And this is the so-called betrayal of Jesus by Judas. What Catholics and most Christians don't understand is that Judas was the greatest of the disciples. There's even a Gospel of Judas. That this was such an important task that Jesus could not have allowed anybody else. He could not have given this job to just anyone and or any other of the apostles. He gave it to Judas because it was the most important task. To become the betrayer of God was to precipitate and ensure that he could play out this cosmic drama, that he could play out the story that would found and become the foundations of what is the most prevalent religion in the world. To demonstrate, to become a living embodiment of the Christ by virtue of crucifixion and resurrection. To die and be reborn, but to die in such a way that would become the stuff of legends. It would literally become a mythology. It would become a religion founded on the fact that its very symbol is Jesus on the cross. Because of the meaning of that, the significance of that. If you didn't watch Passion of the Christ this week, you still have time this weekend to watch it. It's a difficult movie to watch, but it's significant insofar as Mel Gibson pulled no punches. This is a depiction of crucifixion which does not sugarcoat anything. And it forces us to consider the sacrifice and the suffering that the man Jesus underwent in order that he may achieve and fulfill the will of his Father in heaven. And that, of course, is what I entitled today's talk, Good Friday, as the secret key of Easter. If Easter is resurrection, then the key to being born and born again is death. It's sacrifice, it's suffering. It's exactly what I've been saying since we, began in nearly an hour and a half ago, talking about death and renewal in nature. In fact, INRI, INRI, Igne Natura Renovator Integra. The fire renews nature incessantly. That's what INRI. Yes, King of the Jews. That's INRI, Igne Natura Renovator Integra. It is tragic in a way, but also somewhat laughable when in certain spiritual circles, people will attack you for talking about ego death. And then they will play this gaslighting, this passive aggressive gaslighting cleverness, and they'll say, oh, people who talk ego death, that's your ego talking, and so on and so forth. These are people who have never watched Passion of the Christ, and they have no idea of the significance of that. The man who stepped out of the cave on Sunday was not the same man who was nailed on the cross. Might have been the same physical body, but it was a man who was nailed to the cross, and who stepped out of the cave was a God, a living God. And it is only by virtue of that sacrifice and death that that man was able to be reborn a living God, a Christified one. And that's a metaphysical scientific fact, because you cannot embody the absolute force of selflessness through an act of selfishness. It is only through a supreme act of selflessness, the supreme act of selflessness, that you can become one with the force and spirit and source of selflessness itself. This is, you want to talk about energetic entrainment, or just in simple terms of metaphysical alignment. There's only one way to embody the absolute force of selflessness. And it's not through selfishness. It's not through worrying about me and what I want or what I don't want. And it's not through comfort and security. It's also not through superfluous pain and suffering, like pain and suffering for its own sake. So there was this period of time during the Middle Ages that Catholic priests and monks, they would flagellate themselves, right? They would whip themselves, and they would say the rosary or prayers or chanting or whatever they were doing, and they would whip themselves while they were praying or saying the rosary, as if. But this is how clever the ego can be. This is where the people in the New Age may have a point, where you can make something very egotistical out of self-flagellation and self-humiliation, and it's virtue signaling. It's this believing that by arbitrarily causing myself suffering, I'm becoming more spiritual, I'm becoming more Christ-like. But who or what is that sacrifice for? This is the key, right? Self-flagellation and the belief that that's bringing you closer to God is selfishness. It's selfish. It's superfluous. It's unnecessary. It's a waste. And it's completely self-centered. Whereas Jesus on the cross is an act of selflessness. It's a sacrifice and self-sacrifice for the sake of others. That's what that symbol represents. But of course, INRI, Igne Natura Renovator Integra, the fire renews nature incessantly. It also represents something else, the cross. The vertical masculine and the horizontal feminine, and the union of masculine and feminine. This episode is episode 13 of season 6. Last week was episode 12, and you know that there were 12 disciples, sure. But Mary Magdalene makes 13. I believe, someone can check me on the math, but I believe Mary Magdalene was not traditionally counted among the 12 disciples of Jesus, but she was the greatest of the disciples. She was closest to Jesus. Obviously, she was his wife, and they practiced white tantra, because it is only in the forge of Vulcan, is only in the literally making love, the literally forging of the solar bodies. That vehicle, that vessel, must be prepared to receive the fire of fire and the light of lights. And that vehicle, that vessel, must be prepared in the supernal worlds. Those solar bodies, they must be galvanized, they must be forged. And that forge is in fire, the fire of Divine Mother Devi Kundalini Shakti. These are the Pentecostal fires, which come later in the Bible. But that halo about Jesus's head, that halo represents that risen fire, that fire of fire and light of lights, that has risen and illuminated the crown chakra. We are looking at an illuminated one, who is, his physical body is dying on that cross, but that's his animal self, the mortal man, and all of the elements that he chased out of the temple are dying, and that personality, the man that he was, is dying in order so that he may be reborn, Christified one. That is why Jesus was crucified on that cross, and why the spear of destiny, or the Roman who stabs him with what's called the spear of destiny, and out of his side comes water and blood, because the prana, the sexual energy, the prana, the chi, is in the blood, and the water are the sexual waters, and that Jesus was filled with the fire and the water of the waters of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's in those terms that Good Friday needs to be understood as the ultimate metaphysical practice for anyone on the path of the razor's edge, for anyone on the path of the bodhisattva, for anyone longing to become one with the Christ and become a living embodiment of what people call Christ consciousness. Of course, there are other details that we can go through. For instance, even though Judas had to play that part, nonetheless, he plays the part and he betrays Jesus. The other two betrayers of Jesus are Caiaphas, right, the leader of the Pharisees, who speaks at Jesus's so-called trial, and Pilate, who is, of course, the Roman governor of Judea, and he is the one that they bring Jesus before and demand that he be crucified. So Judas and Caiaphas and Pilate represent the three betrayers of Jesus. Pilate, because in the end, Pilate did not want another Jewish uprising to deal with. He had already had to deal with multiple Jewish uprisings, and it was made very clear to him by his superiors that if he messed up again, they would transfer him to who knows where in the empire, like to the furthest reaches of the empire. So he did not want another Jewish uprising. And when he saw how adamant the crowd was demanding and calling for Jesus's crucifixion. And he thought this was very strange when just 5 days earlier, they were waving palms and welcoming Jesus into the city as a hero. And now they wanted him crucified. So Pilate found these Jewish people very strange. So in the end, he says, I wash my hands of this. So he's like, you know what? It's not on me. You guys do whatever you want to him, but I take no responsibility. And so he's also said to be one of the betrayers of Jesus. So Pilate, Caiaphas, and Judas, then, as the three betrayers of Jesus, they represent the three brains of the human machine: mind, heart, and body. Or, said another way, the mental center, the emotional center, and the motor instinctive sexual center. These are wholly congruent with the three murderers of Hiram Abif. Hiram Abif was the architect and the builder of the temple. And according to Freemasonry, was murdered by these three murderers. But these are also the three witches of Macbeth and the three furies of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So they are these three betrayers are that which betray the Christ in us. And that's why we must be vigilant, and we must, in order to be born and be reborn a living Christ, these three brains have to be tamed, but they also have to bring us their gifts. They have to surrender their gifts to our innermost intimate Christ. In other words, the three betrayers of Jesus, Judas, Caiaphas, and Pilate, mirror one-to-one the three wise men who bring their gifts to the newborn baby Jesus. So when Christ is resurrected on Easter Sunday and steps out of the tomb, it's like he is being born again. And so now those who were his betrayers are now the three kings, because Jesus is king of the world. And so the three wise men, the three kings, come bearing gifts. For a Christified master, his mind, heart, and body are wholly in service of the Christ. And that's that symbol in Christmas, when the three wise men come to worship the baby Jesus, the newborn Christ. So there's actually, you can't separate these two stories, because they're really describing the same event, the birth of Christ. Because Christ was truly born, Christ is truly born only after death of the false self. And we see that echoed in the Christmas story, because Mary and Joseph are fleeing infanticide. That Herod orders all the newborns to be slaughtered, and that Mary and Joseph, in the face of that death, give birth to Jesus. So Jesus is born after infanticide, after death, even in the Christmas story, and then in the Nativity. Now, of course, the other famous element of the Nativity is that Mary, that Jesus was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, that Mary was a virgin, and that Mary experienced immaculate conception. Well, that's precisely the immaculate conception is possible only through through the practice of sexual alchemy and white tantra. So that's exactly what leads up to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus between another Mary, this time Mary Magdalene, and Jesus himself. Jesus's experience, again, if you recall Passion of the Christ, or just from the biblical stories or the Passion plays, if you did those when you were in high school or saw them performed, you know that it was a very long and arduous journey up to Golgotha. And the people of Jerusalem were hurling insults and throwing stones, and just this really was an act of uh, terrible humiliation and suffering on multiple different levels, which is why the earlier events of Holy Week, excuse me, the earlier events of Holy Week are so important in establishing how Jesus was prepared and how he was able to endure the crucifixion with relative equanimity and calm, and to be at peace with it, because he had already prepared himself. He had already demonstrated throughout the week. He was prepared mentally and psychologically and emotionally, and he had already overcome his mind and his desires and his pride. Only the last thing he faced was his fear. And even on the cross, he has that moment of doubt and of weakness, of human weakness, when he looks up and he says, oh God, why have you forsaken me?" But there's additionally the symbol of Jesus is crucified between two thieves. And one of these thieves is repentant and the other one is not. And Jesus absolves one of them and says, hear me, this day you will be with me in the kingdom of heaven. And the two thieves that he is crucified in between, those two thieves represent Ida and Pingala, the masculine and feminine energetic channels of the body. And Jesus being crucified in between represents the union of Ida and Pingala, of masculine and feminine. So the Shushumna canal of the spinal column. Again, this is all alluding to the practice of sexual alchemy. So many, many more symbols related to Good Friday and the crucifixion of Jesus, and the metaphysical scientific process by which we undergo psychological death and rebirth. But that is the key to Easter. There's no getting around it. There's no avoiding it. And I think far too many people, because of the way that it was positioned and explained in Catholicism and Christianity, Christians today treat Jesus and his crucifixion like the Jews of Jesus's day were treating the Passover sacrifices and the buying of animals and the borrowing of money to buy sacrificial animals You see, for Christians, it's Jesus who made the sacrifice for our sins, for our sake. Somebody else suffered, somebody else sacrificed. And they believe that because somebody else sacrificed, that they get to go to heaven. But that is not true. That is not how this works. Jesus did not die for our sins so that we can just willy-nilly do whatever we want and enter into heaven. That's not what happened. This is a gross distortion of the facts. Master Abbonamento, which is the innermost, who we call Jesus, did descend from the absolute and did incarnate and did undergo and go through everything he went through and go through that suffering and sacrifice in order to alter the metaphysical parameters for karma on this planet, which means that some sins can be forgiven and that most sins can be negotiated. But it's that bigger one, negotiation. That's what Jesus, his suffering and sacrifice, his ministry made possible. What the Catholic Church twisted and contorted into the act of reconciliation or the act of confession. What that is supposed to be is someone having a negotiation with the lords of karma, saying, I did this, 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 and this, and I'm suffering because of it. But I promise to do good. I promise to do A, B, C, and X, Y, Z in exchange for my karma, for my past sins to be erased. I'm willing to pay. I'm willing to do good works. In other words, it's a negotiation. What that got twisted into is people confessing to a priest, and then the priest telling them, okay, go say 12 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers. No one can enter into the kingdom of heaven who does not in some way embody the spirit and the values of the community of heaven. And so some sins can be forgiven, but not all. And when we say sin, we can use the word karma. It's the same word. It means the same thing. We have debts. What we owe. And if we don't have the currency with which to pay our debts, we can work towards paying off our debts. That's the negotiation. That's what Jesus made possible through his sacrifice. Because that wasn't possible for humanity beforehand. But that got contorted and twisted into the Catholic and the Christian belief, is that all you got to do is believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and boom, you get into heaven. No, it's not how that works. That's not how that works. We have to understand and comprehend what took place on that Good Friday and what took place after Easter Sunday, after Jesus rose from the dead. It wasn't he was around for a few weeks and and Pentecost, and then he ascended into heaven. It's not as it's written in the Bible. Jesus traveled and taught for many, many, many years along with his disciples, and he performed many of his greatest miracles, and much of his greatest teachings were delivered after he rose from the dead. And much of this is documented in the Gnostic Gospels and the Ethiopian Bible and these other authoritative texts that the Council of Nicaea decided to eliminate from its canon, from the Catechism, so called. And so they only kept the four, and they reordered the stories. They reordered them in such a way that it told the story that they wanted to tell. That Jesus was born God, and that because only God, only someone who was a God could defeat death. So that's why for 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has had countless crises of dogma and countless schisms of Christian sects breaking off over the issue of Jesus's mortality. Was he immortal? Was he not? Was he not immortal? Was he God made flesh, or was he? So this has been debated for centuries in Christianity, and again has caused the separation of various sects to go their own way, because they can't. It's just like the virginity of Mary, like, and the virgin birth, and so on. These are issues that, because they don't have uh, the actual metaphysical scientific clarity on the matter, they end up arguing relentlessly about it, and then end up getting divorced over it. But that's what happens when you start, misinterpreting and misrepresenting the facts, and you try molding and folding everything into a narrative that suits your purpose. Well, invariably, people are going to start scratching at the cracks and revealing the cracks in the story, and revealing the misrepresentations and the misinterpretations for what they are, and they won't stand for it. But for me, it's the notion that spirituality or religiosity is a matter of believing in someone who sacrificed their life for me 2,000 years ago. That is an anathema. It has always been an anathema. It's what caused me to break away from the Catholic Church when I did as a young man, and return to it with the missing pieces. Because Christ is not hanging on the cross to tell us, hey, look what I did for you. Christ is hanging that cross to say, if you would be with me, pick up your cross and follow me. That's what he said. That's in the Bible. I didn't make that up. If anyone would be with me, let them pick up their cross and follow me. That's what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say, I died for you, so you don't have to do anything. That's not what he said. So the very notion that millions of people around the world, not even millions, billions of people around the world think all they need to do is believe in Jesus and they have a one-way ticket into heaven. This is to me an anathema. It is anti-religious, it is anti-spiritual, and it is anti-Christian. It is anti-Christic because it denies the nature of Christ, which is in us, the innermost intimate Christ. You want to be with your innermost, your higher self, and embody who you really are? Because the innermost intimate Christ's nature is sacrifice, death, and rebirth. What are you doing each and every day in terms of sacrifice, death, and rebirth? That's the only way you can embody your higher self. You are not going to embody your higher self, your innermost intimate Christ, by believing that a guy went through hell on earth 2,000 years ago, and all you got to do is believe in that. That's not going to connect you to your own innermost intimate Christ. Okay, it's time to chase the money, the money lenders and the livestock traders out of our lives and out of our minds. It's time to chase these bullshit beliefs out of Christianity. Because that's not that is a gross misrepresentation. It's like you might as well be stomping on the cross like the Japanese do in Martin Scorsese's movie Silence, when they're tormenting the priests, and they put a picture of Jesus and Mary down, and they stamp their foot on these sacred symbols, and they tell the priest to do the same thing, otherwise they're going to die. But that's what you're doing. You're shitting on Jesus's legacy. If you think that you're honoring him by believing that he went through all of that to tell you you don't have to make any sacrifices and you don't have to suffer and that you don't have to die psychologically, and that all those so-called, they call themselves born again Christians down in the States, think that they're born again just because they believe in Jesus, just because they came to Jesus moment. Yeah, on one level, you're born again. You're not the asshole you used to be. Now you're a religious asshole who thinks that you're better now than everybody else because you had a came to Jesus moment. Yeah, you're born again in one way. You're not as much of an asshole as you used to be. Big deal. You're still shitting on the legacy of Jesus Christ if you're not doing everything in your power to become a living embodiment in your own unique way. If you are not embodying the spirit and the example of Jesus in your life, and you're not fulfilling the will of your innermost being. This is the hard truth that Easter has to tell us and that Good Friday has to tell us. And why Jesus said, if anyone would be with me, let him take up his cross and follow me. And that cross includes white tantra, the cross of sexual alchemy. But let him take up his cross and follow me. You accept, like Jesus did in the garden, not my will, but thine be done. You accept the suffering and sacrifice that you need to go through in order to die as the animal mortal hominid that you are, so that you can be reborn as a living embodiment, as a true human being, as a living embodiment of Christ consciousness. But that comes, it's hard work. It's suffering and sacrifice. And it's not about you or what you want, because Christ is selflessness. The process is a process of cultivating selflessness. And if you just comprehend, just linguistically, selflessness is achieved when we let go of, when we abandon, when we surrender, and when we sacrifice ourself. There is no path to selflessness holding on to the self. The self cannot go and be one with selflessness. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Because the moment a self enters into a realm of selflessness, guess what? Selflessness is no longer selfless. There's a self there. Can't have that. That's not how this works. That's the key to Easter. That's the hard truth that people and so-called spiritual people up and down the line, they will argue and rationalize and fight you tooth and nail. And they would tell me, they would sit here, right here on this live stream, and they would argue to my face that what I'm saying to you is pure ego. And they would rationalize, they rationalize not pursuing selflessness and not sacrificing the self. They rationalize it on the basis that that's just virtue signaling, that's just ego, that's just mystic pride. And that you need your ego to survive anyway. You need your ego to be. Your ego is important, et cetera, et cetera. And that ego death is just the ultimate in ego. That's why I'm not even going to bother to pursue it. Which is, if you try to deconstruct their thinking and deconstruct the logic of that, you realize how pathetically ludicrous it all is. But regardless, we have a comment here from Benjamin Raphael, who says, it's a long one. In fact, Benjamin, it might have gotten cut off, so there might be a part 2 to this that you need to go back and cut and paste. He says, many preachers today emphasize the belief that salvation comes through faith alone rather than through works, often pointing to the idea that Jesus has already paid the price for all sin. I appreciate you sharing your perspective. It's an important conversation. At the same time, some would argue that this belief can give a false sense of assurance, allowing people to continue in harmful patterns. Ultimately, we are also called to take responsibility for our lives, to carry our crosses, and to ultimately genuinely follow him. Yeah, so on this point, again, I understand. I get it. I'm not naive and I'm not stupid. I know there's a reason why there's only 4 of you watching and not 4,000 or 40,000, right? There's a reason why I don't have a mega church. There's a reason why I'm not preaching to a stadium full of 40,000 people swooning over my words, right? But Joel Osteen has those people, and they do, because he's one of those people that tells them what they want to hear. And he feeds them that warm and fuzzy feeling that Jesus did all the work. That Jesus, because of his sacrifice, you can sit and you can have your McMansion and your 3-car garage stuffed with 2 oversized SUVs and a convertible sports car. And you can go to your PTA meetings and bowling and go on your vacations and do everything you wish to do, because Jesus has done all the work. And don't you love him for that? And that's where your love for Jesus comes from. His sacrifice for you. He gave his life for you, for you and your sins, and he defeated Satan, and he defeated the devil, and on and on. It's like whipping a crowd into a frenzy, you know, for a prize fighter or something, or like, or a politician, or like, it's a cult of personality. And it's of course, people love that. People love to identify and attach themselves and fall into idolatry. And it gives them the warm and fuzzies. And it makes them feel good, and it makes them feel, and of course, so naturally, when you're trying to adopt a religion and make it the official religion of the Roman Empire, naturally, you're going to bring in a whole bunch of theologians and figure out, well, okay, now what do we take out and what do we leave in to make this the most palatable religion that is going to stick, that's going to attract people and make them want to stay. And that's why Jesus himself said, the teachings that I give to you, the disciples, is not for them over there, the others. They get the Sermon on the Mount, but you get the secret teachings. Many of the secret teachings that are in the Gnostic Gospels, or the other redacted Gospels, and in the Pista Sophia. But those teachings have to be somewhere, and they're always been for the few. They've always been for the few. And even then, the teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, right? Like, still, Jesus said to people, like, if anyone would be with me, let them pick up their cross and follow me. He didn't say, I died for you on the cross and resurrected so that you don't have to do anything. Jesus never said that. And his life, his ministry, his service, and his sacrifice speaks volumes. The cosmic drama speaks volumes. It's the Bible is as much show as it is tell. And that we cannot be naive, and we cannot just go through life believing that, oh, well, this is what I've been taught, this is what the church teaches, or whatever, so this must be the way it is. Because I guarantee you, if you go on YouTube and you pull up a video of a dog or a cat, whatever, defending its owner, or saving a baby, or jumping into icy rivers to save someone, or jumping into a burning building to save someone, you look at that and your heart wells up, because you're watching an act of heroism. You're watching an act of suffering and sacrifice, an animal throwing itself, possibly, throwing itself in front of a bear, or into a freezing river or burning building, right? Risking death itself for the sake of another. That's the Christ at work. And that's why your heart wells up when you witness acts of sacrifice, and acts of courage, and acts of selflessness. And that when you're even in just the same energy field as witnessing someone doing a selfless act, and you get all warm and fuzzy on the inside. How can you then deny yourself that that is the way? When God reveals himself, when Christ reveals himself to you here and now, moment by moment, in acts of kindness and self-sacrifice and selflessness and courage, and you see that and you feel it on the inside, how can you then switch over and rationalize and make the case that I don't have to do that? All I got to do is believe in this guy that did that 2,000 years ago. I'm sorry. It's a fundamental disconnect. You cannot convince me. There's nothing that you can say that can negate my experience of the Christ and my direct conscious experience of Christ. There is nothing you can tell me about all these churches and priests and pastors and what they've studied and learned and indoctrinated and blah, 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 blah. It's all bullshit compared to having a direct experience of the Christ. And when you know your innermost intimate Christ, and when you've been touched by the Christ, I'm sorry. The Christ did not say ever that because I did this once, everybody's off the hook. No. No. That is not the Christ of the Bible. That is not the Christ of the universe. That is the Christ of an organization giving warm and fuzzies and trying to make telling everybody what they want to hear in order to maximize their recruitment strategy. Benjamin Raphael says, I can see the effects of these beliefs, as I've noticed that many so-called Christians online tend to be quite materialistic, often embracing manifesting ideas and attempting to support them with principles from the Bible. Yeah, that's, well, look, we're in the Kali Yuga, we're in the end times, and the Black Lodge is very good at what it does. And America, let's face it, is perhaps the most materialistic country on the planet, and perhaps the most well, not the most mechanistic. That'll have to be China. But we shouldn't be surprised that Christians can behave this way or that way. Believe me, I've known many a self-styled Gnostic who behaves this way and that way as well. So people can call themselves many things and believe many things and do many things and say many things and so on. So, but the fact of the matter is that there is only one way to Christ, and that is by knowing your own innermost intimate Christ. And my goal today was to share with you from Holy Week the practical examples that Jesus gave us to show us what it takes to know our innermost intimate Christ. And to recap, from Palm Sunday, to master your mind, and Monday, eradicate the desires, the egos, the defects and vices from the temple, and the hypocrisy, and to recognize and transform and transmute the living Christ in the impressions that we take in that which we eat, but also that which we watch and that which we listen to. And to actually practice that unction in our lives, that we recognize the Christ as at the heart and soul and the foundation of everything. So that communion, that holy communion with Christ, we make that an aspect and a part of our daily life, that we remember our Divine Mother and so that every expression of the masculine expression of the Christ we receive, and we receive from our innermost divine mother, and then with that union we experience the alchemy of Christification a little bit each and every moment, each and every day, and then humbling ourselves, reducing ourselves, not taking ourselves so seriously, and certainly not self-aggrandizing ourselves and getting big heads and believing we're better than everybody else, but lowering ourselves down to serve others and raise others up. It's not by accident that I am here under the mantle of Attlas, who holds up the pillars of heaven and earth, and who raises up. Like that's what Jesus getting down on his knees and washing the feet of his disciples is about. He's raising them up. He is allowing those who he came to teach to lord over him in that moment, to become lords of the earth, as he the master of masters on this planet bows down and lowers himself down and makes of himself a lowly servant. Humility, in other words. And then how to pray such that it's not my will but thine be done. To pray for strength and endurance and the resilience to endure what is to come, to be able to live up to and fulfill the will of the Father. This is why we pray, to give us strength, not to give us what we want, to give us what we need in order to fulfill our destiny. And then Friday, Good Friday, in which it all culminates in that sacrifice, in that service, in that ultimate act of self-sacrifice, the giving of one's life. And the symbol of the cross, the sexual alchemy of the masculine and feminine, the union of masculine and feminine. All of these are practical teachings, practical practices that we can do every day, and that we should keep in mind, and that we should, when we see Jesus on the cross, we should be reminded how to live, how to take up our own cross so that we may follow him, follow in his footsteps, follow in his example. Like there's a meme that goes around on the internet that says, Christ did not come here to create Christians. Christ came here to show us what it takes to become Christs, to make more Christs, to become Christified. Benjamin says in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5-8, who, being in very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because people have this twisted, messed up, egotistical view of God as lording over everything, and as this huge, monumental, strong, controlling, dominant force. Why? Because we project that onto him. But I tell you, he is the absolute abstract essence and source of selflessness. Selflessness. What the hell does selflessness want to do or have to do with lording over and dominating and controlling? And no. If God became man, what else could he have done? Nothing, if he was truly God. And if he was truly here to become a living God man, how else could he have behaved? What else could he have done? Nothing but show us the steps and the aspects, the practical means to achieve oneness with the absolute source and spirit of selflessness. So it's exactly what Philippians says here. And being found in appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Because that's what selflessness does. Think about, I mean, and this isn't rocket science. Anyone who has a child, who is a good mother, who is a good father, knows that aspect, that essence, that spirit of selflessness. What would you not do for your child? What would a newborn mother not do for her infant child? It's not rocket science. It's obvious. It's self-evident. And that parents of a newborn child, the joy, their very lives are now all of a sudden completely turned upside down and on its head, and the entire focus of their existence, of their marriage, of their very being is this beautiful being that they brought into this world, that now everything revolves around this little being that they brought into this world, and all sorts of selfishness falls away. And they're getting up in the middle of the night to feed it or change its diaper or do whatever, right? And the outpouring. I was given this gift by my late mother when she was diagnosed with cancer. She was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer, which meant that she only had about 2 months to live, and she only lived for about 2 months. But for those 2 months, I was there to take care of her. And for 2 months, nothing but absolute unconditional love poured out of me towards her. And the number of times I had to get up in the middle of the night to help her go sit on the potty, or when she went and tried to sit on the potty and fell off the potty and spilled the bedpan, and everything that was in the bedpan was all over the bedroom. And I was on my hands and knees cleaning that up in the middle of the night. And I was filled with nothing but pure unconditional love, pure selflessness towards my mother, who I knew was not long for this world. And she could do no wrong in my eyes. She could not frustrate me or upset me in any way, shape, or form. No matter what she needed or wanted or did or didn't do, it was just nothing but absolute unconditional love pouring through me towards her. And there is nothing can compare to that. to living a life of service and sacrifice, of experiencing that purity of that selflessness toward another who truly needs it and needs is in need of that selflessness, is in need of that love, of that caring. So I can only imagine that amidst all of the torment and the pain, the suffering, the angry crowds hurtling their insults and everything else towards him, that even then on the cross, Jesus would have had the opportunity to feel and appreciate the sacrifice that he was making, and why it was even recorded that forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That he, even then, he had compassion, and he could feel that unconditional love for those who were nailing him to the cross. And that the church would deny its followers the direct conscious experience of that out of fear, because the church had to position itself between the masses and God. We are the official representatives of God. We are the intercessor. We have to get between you and asking God for forgiveness, right? We call that confession. We have to put ourselves between you and God, right? So you experience God when you come to our church, when you build these big cathedrals for us, and so on and so forth. And the church today is one of the wealthiest organizations in the world. They pay no taxes. That they would deny the children of God a direct one-to-one conscious experiential knowledge of the Christ, to know their own innermost intimate Christ, and to feel that unconditional love, and to be able to cultivate that, right? That selflessness, right? There's a reason why the Catholic Church did not want people to cultivate that. And that is because if there's one thing the Catholic Church is terrified of more than anything, is to be seen as hypocritical. Because any organization that is rolling in untold billions of dollars of wealth, and that hoards untold priceless artifacts and art and gold and who knows what else in the Vatican archives, and keeps it from humanity, while there are people starving all over the world and suffering all over the world, that organization is not the living embodiment of selflessness. I'm sorry, it isn't. It just isn't. It cannot be. You cannot square that circle, and you cannot explain to me that if that they truly are the living representatives of God, and the official representatives of the ultimate abstract spirit and source of selflessness, why they hoard billions of dollars in wealth and priceless artifacts and knowledge and so on and so forth in their archives under the Vatican, and why they take in 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more money than what they pay out in charity. Is that selflessness? Is that what Jesus on the cross represent? Is that what Jesus wanted when he was hanging on the cross? Boy, I'm sure they honor. I sure hope they honor me by making this massive global multinational corporation that lives in the lap of luxury and builds incredible monuments in its own honor, and to honor me hanging here on the cross while it hoards billions of dollars of wealth and precious artifacts and everything else and keeps it from the people, and gets people to donate money all the time to upkeep these exorbitant, extravagant houses in my honor. Boy, I hope that's what happens. I hope that's the takeaway people get from me hanging on the cross here. It's not rocket science. You know, you do this exercise in meditation and you put yourself on that cross and then see what these so-called Christian leaders and organizations and pastors and so on, what they profess and what they claim, and then you very quickly arrive at, gee, I don't know if that's what Jesus had in mind when he was hanging there on the cross. Just a little something to take away. Um, the secret keys to Easter are not all that secret. It doesn't, they're hiding in plain sight. And they're really self-evident. And all you got to do is go within and connect with your innermost intimate Christ. And he'll show you everything you need to see, and he'll tell you everything you need to know. And he'll guide you and take you everywhere you need to be. And he'll whisper to you everything that he wants you to do in the moment that he wants you to do it. And he'll whisper everything he wants you to say in the moment that he needs you to say it. All you got to do is let go and surrender, and like Jesus in the garden. Not my will, but thine be done. That is the key to Easter. That is the key to taking up your cross and following Christ. Does anybody have any questions? No questions, any comments, any arguments, any anecdotes, any thoughts, any stock recommendations, stock tips, tax tips? Wow, it's getting to be tax time too. I don't know what the weather is like where you are in the world, but here it was even like we had some sleet, like some icy, snowy stuff falling. I don't know if you could even hear it hitting up against the glass earlier. It's been crazy. We've been going from 20 degrees centigrade down to 4, back to 20, and it's just going up and down like a yo-yo. It's been crazy, and not the best for energy, for keeping our energy up. But in any case, Benjamin Raphael says, thank you so much for today's very enlightening discussion, sir. Well, thank you, Benjamin, for being here. I thank all of you for being here. I want to wish all of you once again a very happy Easter to you and to your family, to your loved ones. Benjamin also says, I hope more people have the opportunity to hear your message, as it can be truly helpful in their spiritual journey. Look, I have resigned myself to not worry about that. If that's meant to be, it'll happen in its own time, in its own way. Something tells me that the world just isn't ready yet. Things haven't gotten bad enough But things are going to be falling apart rather precipitously. So when they do, perhaps more people will take interest in, for example, my book, and it was basically telling them what in hell is with us, what the hell is going on. So, but Leah says, much love all. Thank you, Leah, and happy Easter to you and to everyone, to your family, to your friends, to everyone whom you hold dear. I hope you have a wonderful Easter and that springtime rapidly comes upon us, and that rebirth and renewal happens in all of our lives. But I especially wish that for you on your spiritual journey. I especially wish it for you that you take to heart these secrets that I've been sharing with you over the past few weeks, that I've really been trying to hone in on, focus on, like some of the key practical things that we can do and focus on, and how to do and how to focus. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I don't generally get into so much of the nitty gritty, deep esoteric stuff, because others have done that, and they've devoted their life to that, and they've studied, they've read, they've memorized, they're so much better at it. And but none of that's going to help if you don't get the basics down, the practical stuff, the meaningful practical stuff where the rubber meets the road. Right? That's what I'm all about. And that's why I do these things like mostly off the cuff, and like, last week was a bit of an exception, me reading and so on. But um, it's 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 so important that we have to practically, in a meaningful way, take up our cross and follow in the footsteps of Christ. But what does that mean, and how do we do that? What are the actual meaningful practical steps? That's what these secret key uh, episodes have been about. And it really culminated in this. And maybe next week we'll go in a different direction. Maybe not. Maybe we'll continue on in the same vein. We'll see. We'll see. I don't know. I don't know, because I'll receive that direction, when we're closer to next week. But until then, have a great week. Have a safe week. I hope that this nice spring weather is going to be blessing you wherever you are, and take these blessings from this Easter and this opportunity for renewal and rebirth, and let all of that move you as you continue moving forward on your path of awakening and self-realization. So until then, take care. All the best to you and yours. Once again, happy Easter, and as always, inferential peace. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.